There's no pain like burying your own children, and no rage like knowing their killers walk free. For 3 long winters, Ragnar Stonehand has carried that burden. A giant of a man, broken by grief, haunted by the night raiders, took everything from him. He was once the most feared warrior in the northern fjords, but what good are strong arms when they couldn't protect the ones you love most? Now those same killers sit bound in his longhouse, and the whole village expects blood for blood. The law failed him before, but tonight justice rests in his hands alone. Every father knows the choice he faces, but what will this old Viking choose when vengeance and wisdom pull him in different directions? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The longhouse of Hjarnfell stood like a monument to better times, its massive oak beams blackened by decades of hearth smoke and celebration. Once the great hall had echoed with laughter and the clash of drinking horns, but now it held only shadows and the weight of unfinished business. Ragnar Stonehand sat in the carved chair that had been his father's and his grandfather's before him, staring at his hands, those same hands that had once wielded axes with deadly precision, that had built cradles for his children, that had closed their eyes for the last time. The wooden toys scattered across the floor of his family quarters told a story no skald would ever sing. A carved wolf, its tail chipped from countless adventures. A miniature longship with a sail made from Astrid's old apron. Toy warriors that Eric had lined up for battles that would never come. They lay there still, gathering dust in rooms Ragnar could no longer bear to enter. Silent witnesses to the innocence that raiders had stolen 3 winters past. Hjarnfell had been prosperous once, nestled in a valley where the river met the fjord, protected by steep cliffs and Ragnar's reputation. The village sprawled along the water's edge, stone houses with turf roofs, workshops where smiths hammered iron into tools and weapons, drying racks heavy with fish that would feed families through the harsh months ahead. Children had played safely in the streets, their mothers spinning wool while their fathers tended fields or sailed to trade with distant settlements. Ragnar remembered when his own children had been among them. Eric, barely 10 summers old, but already showing promise with a practice sword, his dark hair wild from running through the village. Little Ingrid, only 7, who could weave flowers into crowns and make even the gruffest warriors smile with her gap-toothed grin. And Astrid, his beloved Astrid, whose laugh could fill their home with warmth even in the darkest winter. Those days seemed like someone else's life now. You're brooding. Again, came a familiar voice from the doorway. Bjorn Ironwill stood there, his weathered face creased with concern. Ragnar's oldest friend bore scars from a dozen campaigns, but none cut as deep as watching his brother-in-arms waste away with grief. I'm thinking, Ragnar replied without looking up. Same thing. With you. Bjorn stepped into the hall, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The prisoners are secure. Olaf wants to know when you'll hear their case. Ragnar's jaw tightened. 3 Svartfjord warriors sat chained in the village storehouse, captured after a failed cattle raid 2 days prior. Word had spread quickly through Hjarnfell. The enemies who had escaped justice for 3 years were finally within reach of Ragnar's vengeance. Let them wait. Ragnar said, the village won't wait much longer. They expect, I know what they expect. Ragnar's voice carried an edge that made Bjorn fall silent. They expect the old Ragnar, the one who solved problems with steel. Bjorn studied his friend's face, seeing something there that troubled him. What's wrong with solving this problem with steel? They killed Eric and Ingrid. They killed Astrid. Blood calls for blood. It's our way. Our way. Ragnar stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding from the chair. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, he had earned his name Stonehand through strength that could crush a man's skull or split a shield with a single blow. But strength hadn't protected his family when it mattered most. Ragnar, do you remember why they called me Stonehand, Bjorn? His friend frowned. Because your grip could, because I never let go. Ragnar walked to the great hearth where embers still glowed from the morning fire. when I grabbed an enemy's weapon, when I held a position in battle, when I made a promise I never let go. It's what made me a good warrior, the best warrior. But what does a warrior become when there's nothing left to fight for? Ragnar picked up a poker and stirred the coals, watching sparks rise toward the smoke hole. When the thing he was meant to protect is already gone. Bjorn had no answer for that. He'd watched Ragnar retreat into himself after the raid, refusing challenges from younger warriors, ignoring disputes that once would have brought swift justice. The man who had once been the beating heart of Hjarnfell had become its silent, brooding ghost. The village needs leadership, Bjorn said quietly. They need to see justice done. Justice. Ragnar tested the word like it was foreign to his tongue. Tell me, old friend, if I take their heads tomorrow, will that bring my children back? Will Astrid's laughter fill this hall again? No, but it will show that we protect our own. That there are consequences for spilling innocent blood. And what consequences were there for us failing to protect them in the first place? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Bjorn had been part of the hunting party that night, tracking elk in the high country while raiders crept into the village below. They'd all shared the guilt, but none more than Ragnar, who had chosen duty to provide winter meat over staying home with his family. We couldn't have known, Bjorn said. Couldn't we? Ragnar set down the poker and turned to face his friend. The Svartfjord clan had been testing our boundaries for months. Cattle disappeared. Fishing nets were cut. There were signs, and I ignored them because I thought my reputation would be enough. I thought no one would dare. You thought like a father, not a warrior. You thought your children were safe in their beds, and I was wrong. The words came out like stones dropping into deep water. I was hunting elk while they were hunting my family. Footsteps approached from outside, and Olaf the law speaker appeared in the doorway. Old beyond his years, with a white beard that reached his chest and eyes sharp as winter steel, Olaf had been settling disputes in Hjarnfell since before Ragnar was born. He carried himself with the authority of one who had memorized every law, every precedent, every blood debt that bound their people together. Ragnar, he said with a formal nod, the village council awaits your decision. Do they now? Ragnar's tone held no warmth. And what decision is that, Olaf? The prisoners have been identified. Thorvald the Red, Gunnar Bloodaxe, and young Ulf Eriksson. All three participated in the raid that took your family. The evidence is clear, the crime undeniable. By our laws, they forfeit their lives. By our laws, Ragnar repeated. The same laws that demanded compensation 3 years ago. The same laws that let their Jarl claim his men acted without orders and offer 3 cattle as payment for my wife and children. Olaf's weathered face showed no emotion. The law failed then because proof was lacking, and their Jarl was clever with words. This time is different. They were caught in the act, weapons in hand, stealing cattle. The crime matters less than the opportunity for justice. Justice. Again that word, bitter on Ragnar's tongue. You speak of justice, but what you mean is vengeance. The village wants blood to wash away the shame of letting killers escape. The village wants closure, Bjorn interjected. They want to see their protector act like a protector again. Ragnar looked between his oldest friend and the man who had taught him the laws of his people. Both good men, both speaking what they believed was truth, but neither had held their murdered children in their arms. Neither had promised a dying wife they would keep their babies safe. I'll hear them tomorrow, Ragnar said finally. In the morning when the whole village can witness whatever judgment I render. And what judgment will that be? Olaf asked. Ragnar walked to the great doors of the longhouse and pushed them open, letting in the cold air that carried the scent of snow from the mountains. Outside, Hjarnfell went about its daily business, women tending gardens, men repairing nets, children playing games in the fading light. It looked peaceful, normal, like the village his own children had grown up in. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I know this. Whatever happens tomorrow will echo through generations. The choice I make will tell every child in this village what kind of man they should strive to become. He stepped outside, leaving Bjorn and Olaf to exchange worried glances. The giant of Hjarnfell walked slowly through his village, nodding to the people who still looked to him for protection, for answers he wasn't sure he had. They expected Ragnar Stonehand, the warrior who had never lost a battle, never backed down from a fight, never let an enemy escape his vengeance. But that man had died with his family 3 winters ago. What stood in his place was something different, a father carrying the weight of failure, a leader questioning everything he had once believed about strength and justice and the price of peace. Tomorrow, he would have to decide which man the village needed him to be. The harvest festival of 3 years past had been the finest in Hjarnfell's memory. The grain stores were full, the catch had been bountiful, and even the weather had blessed them with clear skies and gentle winds. Astrid had spent days preparing, her hands flying as she wove new patterns into their best tapestries, humming songs that made Eric and Ingrid dance around the longhouse like spirits of joy themselves. Ragnar could still taste the honey mead from that night, still hear the laughter echoing off the rafters as the village celebrated another successful season. He had been proud of his people's prosperity, proud of his family's happiness, proud of the peace he had helped build in their little corner of the world. That pride had made him careless. The call to hunt had come from Bjorn, who had spotted elk tracks in the high meadows. Winter would arrive soon, and fresh meat would be needed to supplement their stores. It was the responsible thing to do, the practical choice. Astrid had kissed him goodbye at the door, little Ingrid clinging to his leg, while Eric promised to protect his mother and sister while father was away. "I'll bring back the biggest elk in the mountains," Ragnar had boasted, lifting his son into the air. "Big enough to last us until spring. Be careful, my love," Astrid had whispered against his ear. "Come home safe to us," he had promised he would. He always did. The hunting party had made camp in the hills above the village, planning to track the elk at dawn, when their movement would be easier to follow. They built a small fire, shared stories, and fell asleep under stars that seemed to promise another day of blessing. Ragnar remembered dreaming of his family, of teaching Eric to track game through the forest, of watching Ingrid learn her mother's skills at the loom. He woke to the smell of smoke, not the clean smoke of their campfire, but the thick, choking black smoke that came from burning homes. Ragnar sat up, his warrior's instincts screaming danger even before his mind could process what he was seeing. Far below in the valley, orange flames licked at the darkness where Hjarnfell should have been sleeping peacefully. "Raiders!" Bjorn shouted, already strapping on his weapons. "The village is under attack!" They ran down the mountain like men possessed, crashing through underbrush and leaping over streams. But the distance that had seemed so small in daylight stretched endlessly in the dark. Every step felt like a betrayal, every heartbeat a reminder that his family was down there unprotected, while he stumbled through the forest like a drunk man. By the time they reached the village, the raiders were gone. Ragnar found his home first, drawn by an instinct stronger than thought. The front door, carved with protective runes by his own father, hung blackened and broken on its hinges. The sight of that burnt doorframe, still standing like a monument to violation, would haunt him for the rest of his days. Smoke poured from the windows, and the smell of burning thatch mixed with something else, something that made his stomach clench with primal fear. He found them in Eric's room. His son lay sprawled across the floor, a wooden practice sword still clutched in his small hands. The boy had tried to fight, had tried to protect his family just as he had promised. But what could a child do against grown warriors with steel and axes? Eric's face was peaceful in death, as if he had simply fallen asleep, but the blood pooling beneath his small body told a different story. Ingrid was in her mother's arms on Astrid's bed. His wife had wrapped herself around their daughter, trying to shield her with her own body. The wounds on Astrid's back showed she had died, protecting their child. But even her fierce love hadn't been enough. Ingrid's tiny hand still held one of the flower crowns she loved to make, its petals wilted and stained. Ragnar knelt beside them, his massive hands shaking as he touched faces that were already growing cold. These were the hands that had defeated countless enemies, that had built this house beam by beam, that had held these precious lives when they were born. Now they could only bear witness to his failure. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No, no, no." His roar of anguish shattered the silence of the burning village. A sound of pain so pure and raw that it seemed to come from the earth itself. Bjorn and the other hunters found him there, still holding his family, his grief so complete that for a moment they thought the raiders might have killed him too. The village slowly gathered around the wreckage of Ragnar's life. Neighbors who had escaped the raid wept openly, sharing stories of the attack. The Svartfjord clan had struck during the feast, when guards were drunk and fighters were celebrating instead of watching. They had moved through the village like shadows, targeting specific homes, specific families. But no home had been hit harder than Ragnar's. "They came for you," old Magda whispered, clutching her own grandchild close. "They knew you were gone. They planned this." The words hit Ragnar like physical blows. This hadn't been a random raid for cattle or silver. This had been personal, calculated. Someone had watched his family, learned his habits, waited for the perfect moment to strike. His reputation as a protector had made his loved ones targets. In the days that followed, as they prepared the funeral pyres and counted their losses, the details emerged. 7 families had been attacked, but only 3 had suffered deaths. The raiders had taken some cattle, some silver, but those seemed like afterthoughts. The real purpose had been terror, humiliation, showing the great Ragnar Stonehand that his strength meant nothing when it wasn't there to be used. The law demanded justice, and Ragnar had demanded it too. Messengers were sent to the Svartfjord settlement, demanding the raiders be turned over for punishment. The response came back with insults instead of criminals. Jarl Hakon claimed his men had been hunting seals that night, offered 3 cattle as compensation for the unfortunate misunderstanding, and suggested that if Ragnar had been guarding his family properly, they would still be alive. The village had raged at the insult, but the law was clear, without proof. Without witnesses who could identify specific raiders, there could be no blood vengeance, only compensation, and even that had been a pittance compared to the lives lost. Ragnar had stared at those 3 scrawny cattle and felt something break inside him that had never healed. "We'll get them," Bjorn had promised. "Someday, somehow, we'll make them pay." But someday had stretched into months, then seasons, then years. The Svartfjord clan grew bolder, raiding other settlements, always careful to leave no proof, always hiding behind their jarl's cunning words. Ragnar withdrew into himself, his legendary strength becoming a burden rather than a gift. What good was being the mightiest warrior in the fjords if you couldn't protect the 3 people who mattered most? The toys remained where they had fallen that night. Astrid's loom stood unfinished, her tapestry half complete. The burnt doorframe was rebuilt, but never felt whole again. Everything in Ragnar's world became a reminder of his failure, a monument to the night when being away hunting elk had cost him everything that made life worth living. Now, 3 years later, fate had delivered 3 Svartfjord warriors into his hands. Not the same men. These raiders were younger, their crimes smaller. But they wore the same clan markings, served the same jarl, represented the same people who had murdered his family and escaped justice. The village expected him to take their heads. The law demanded blood for blood. His own heart screamed for vengeance that had been too long delayed. But as Ragnar sat in the darkness of his longhouse, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter that would never return, he wondered if more death would truly bring the peace he sought, or simply add more fuel to a fire that had already consumed everything he loved. The years since the raid had passed like stones sinking through dark water, slow, inevitable, and heavy with the weight of things that could never be recovered. Ragnar's days had fallen into a rhythm of survival rather than living. He rose before dawn, tended to village matters with mechanical efficiency, and retreated to his longhouse when the sun set, carrying silence like armor against a world that expected him to be whole. Astrid's loom still stood in their bedroom, exactly as she had left it that final morning. The half-finished tapestry stretched across the wooden frame showed a family scene, A tall man with dark hair teaching a boy to hold a sword, while a woman and young girl picked flowers in a meadow beyond. She had been weaving their life into something beautiful, something permanent, something that would outlast them all. Ragnar touched the thread sometimes, running his scarred fingers over her careful work. The colors had faded slightly in the 3 years since her death, but her skill remained clear in every knot and pattern. She had planned to finish it before winter, had smiled when she told him it would hang in their hall during the long, dark months ahead. To remind us of summer when the snow comes, she had said. Now it reminded him only of dreams interrupted, of hands that would never complete their work, of a future that had died with the woman who wove it. The village had tried to help in those early months. Neighbors brought food, offered to clean his house, suggested he take a new wife to ease his loneliness. Their kindness had been genuine, but it felt like pressure against wounds too deep to heal. Eventually, they learned to leave him alone with his grief, understanding that some losses carve too deeply to be shared. "You're wasting away," Bjorn told him, on a grey morning 2 days after the raiders' capture. They stood on the cliff overlooking the fjord, watching fishing boats return with the dawn catch. "Look at yourself, Ragnar. When did you last eat a full meal? When did you last sleep through the night?" Ragnar said nothing. Sleep brought dreams, and dreams brought memories he wasn't strong enough to face. Better to doze fitfully, to wake before the visions could take hold completely. "The village needs you," Bjorn continued. "Not the ghost you've become, but the leader you were. These prisoners, this is your chance to reclaim that." "Reclaim what? The illusion that I could protect anyone? The truth that you're still the strongest man in Jarnfell? That your word still carries weight, your judgment still matters?" Ragnar picked up a stone and hurled it toward the water far below. "My judgment told me to hunt elk while my family slept unguarded. My strength failed when it mattered most. One mistake doesn't erase a lifetime of service. It erases everything that made that service worthwhile." They walked back through the village in silence, past workshops where smiths hammered iron into tools that would outlast the hands that made them, past gardens where women tended plants that would feed families through the winter ahead. Life continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to one man's grief. But everywhere Ragnar looked, he saw reminders of the world he had once believed he could protect. The storehouse where the prisoners waited sat at the edge of the village, its thick walls designed to hold grain and preserved fish through the lean months. Now it held 3 men whose fate would be decided by sunset. Village law demanded that justice be swift once guilt was established. But guilt itself had become a complicated thing. Olaf was waiting when they reached the building, his ancient face grave with the weight of precedent and tradition. "The prisoners have asked to speak with you," he said. "Have they now?" Ragnar's voice carried no emotion. And what could they possibly have to say? "They claim they have information about the raid 3 years past, about who ordered it and why." Something cold moved through Ragnar's chest. "What kind of information?" "They won't say unless you agree to hear them personally. It seems even condemned men have their pride." Bjorn spat in the dirt. "Lies and desperation. They'll say anything to save their necks." "Perhaps," Olaf agreed. "But by law, they have the right to speak before judgment is passed. And you have the right to hear them or not, as you choose." Ragnar stared at the storehouse door, imagining the men beyond it. Young warriors, probably, seeking glory through raiding and violence just as he once had. The cycle continued, generation after generation, sons learning to kill from fathers who had learned to kill from their fathers before them. "What would you do, old friend?" he asked Olaf. The law speaker considered carefully before answering. "When I was young, I would have heard them out of curiosity. When I was middle-aged, I would have heard them out of duty. Now that I am old, I would hear them because wisdom sometimes comes from unexpected sources. And if they're lying, then you'll know liars when you see them, and the village will witness their deception. If they speak truth," Olaf shrugged. "Truth has a way of changing how we see the past." Ragnar looked toward his longhouse, where Astrid's unfinished tapestry waited in the gathering dust. He thought of Eric's practice sword, still lying where he had placed it after the funeral, too precious to move, but too painful to see. He thought of Ingrid's flower crowns, dried and brittle now, but still scattered where her small hands had dropped them. 3 years of carrying those memories like stones in his chest. 3 years of waking each day to the knowledge that his family was gone and their killers walked free. 3 years of being the strong man, the protector, the leader who had failed when failure mattered most. "I'll hear them," he said finally. "But not alone. Bjorn, you'll witness. Olaf, you'll record whatever they say for the village council. And after you've heard them," Bjorn asked. Ragnar tested the weight of his war axe on his belt, feeling its familiar balance against his hip. The weapon had served him well in dozens of battles, had split shields and ended feuds, had been the final argument in disputes that words couldn't settle. "Tomorrow it might taste blood again, if justice demanded it. After I've heard them," he said, "I'll decide what kind of man this village needs me to be." But as they approached the storehouse door, Ragnar found himself wondering if the man he had been was truly dead, or simply sleeping beneath the weight of grief and guilt. The prisoners inside might have answers to questions that had haunted him for 3 years, or they might have nothing but desperate lies meant to buy them a few more hours of life. Either way, he would hear them out. Not because he owed them anything, but because he owed his family and himself the truth about what had happened that terrible night when the world changed forever. The iron judgment seat had been carved from a single massive oak over 2 centuries ago, its arms worn smooth by generations of hands that had gripped them while making decisions that would echo through bloodlines. The chair sat at the head of the longhouse, elevated on a platform that reminded all who saw it that justice required perspective, distance from the heat of emotion that clouded judgment. Ragnar had avoided sitting in it since his father's death 5 years prior. The responsibility felt too heavy, the precedent too demanding. His father had been a wise leader, careful with his words and measured in his punishments. But his father had never lost everything that mattered to him in a single night of blood and flame. Now the whole village had gathered to watch him take that seat and render judgment on 3 Svartfjord warriors. Men, women, and children filled the longhouse, their faces reflecting the same hunger for vengeance that had been building for 3 years. They wanted blood. They wanted their protector to protect them, even if it came too late for his own family. The prisoners were brought in chains that clanked with each step. Thorvald the Red walked first, a man of perhaps 30 winters, with the scars of many battles marking his arms and face. His red beard was braided with silver rings that spoke of successful raids, and his eyes held the calculating look of a warrior who had survived by being clever as well as strong. Behind him came Gunnar Bloodaxe, younger but broader, with the thick build of a man who settled disputes with strength rather than words. His axe, the weapon that had earned him his name, had been taken when he was captured, but his hands still moved as if feeling for its familiar weight. The 3rd prisoner made Ragnar pause. Ulf Eriksson was barely 18 summers old, with the soft face of youth still unmarked by serious battle. He walked with the swagger of a boy, trying to seem like a man, but his eyes darted nervously around the crowded longhouse. He wore no rings of honor, carried no reputation for great deeds. This was likely his first major raid. "Bind them there," Ragnar commanded, pointing to iron rings set into the floor before the judgment seat. The chains were secured, leaving the 3 men kneeling in a line, their fates resting entirely in his hands. Olaf stepped forward with the formal speaking staff, its carved runes gleaming in the firelight. "By the laws of our people and the customs of our fathers, we gather to hear charges against these men of the Svartfjord clan. They stand accused of raiding, theft, and trespass on the lands of Jarnfell. The charges are proven," Bjorn added. "They were caught with our cattle, weapons in hand, with no permission to be on our lands." Thorvald the Red lifted his head, meeting Ragnar's gaze directly. "We do not deny the charges," he said, his voice steady despite his bonds. "We are warriors, and we were raiding, but we ask for the right to speak before judgment is passed." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Some shouted for immediate execution, others called for the traditional punishment of outlawry. But Ragnar raised his hand, and silence fell like snow on the longhouse. "You have information about the raid 3 years past," he said. "Speak it." "First, we would know what our words might buy us," Thorvald replied. "Are we speaking to dead men, or is there a chance for life?" "You're speaking to the man whose family your clan murdered." Ragnar's voice carried the weight of barely controlled rage. "If you have truth to tell, tell it. If you have lies prepared, save your breath for the afterlife." Thorvald nodded slowly. "Fair enough. The raid that killed your wife and children, it was not planned by our Jarl." The longhouse erupted in angry shouts. "Lies!" someone called out. "Svartfjord cowardice!" shouted another. But Ragnar leaned forward, something in the prisoner's tone demanding attention. "Explain," he commanded. "Jarl Hakon received orders from outside our clan. A man came to our settlement in the dark of night, offered silver, and promised protection if we struck at Jarnfell during your absence. He knew you would be hunting that week. He knew exactly when and where to strike." Young Ulf shifted nervously in his chains. "Tell him about the children," he whispered urgently to Thorvald. "Quiet, boy," Gunnar growled, but it was too late. Ragnar's eyes fixed on the youngest prisoner. "What about the children?" Ulf's voice shook as he spoke. "We were told. The stranger told our warriors that your family kept stolen treasure hidden in your home, that your children knew where it was hidden, and that—" he swallowed hard, "that they would have to be questioned to find it." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if the flames themselves held their breath. Ragnar's knuckles went white where he gripped the arms of the judgment seat. "You're saying my children were tortured for treasure that didn't exist," he said, each word falling like stones into still water. "We didn't know," Ulf said desperately. "The men who went that night, they were told the children would cooperate, that it would be quick and clean. When they found no treasure, when the children couldn't tell them what they didn't know, they killed them anyway," Ragnar finished. "Yes," Thorvald said quietly, "and the stranger disappeared the next day, leaving our clan to face your vengeance alone." Bjorn stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is obviously a lie meant to save their worthless lives. Why should we believe any of this?" "Because," Thorvald said, looking directly at Ragnar, "the stranger knew things about your household that no Svartfjord warrior could have known. He knew your wife kept her jewelry in a carved box beneath your bed. He knew your son practiced with a wooden sword every morning behind the longhouse. He knew your daughter made flower crowns and left them on the windowsill to dry." The details hit Ragnar like physical blows. These were private things, family intimacies that only someone who had watched his home carefully could have known. Someone who had studied his family, learned their habits, prepared for their destruction with cold calculation. Who was this stranger? He demanded. "We never learned his true name," Thorvald admitted. "But he bore the mark of a raven on his arm, and he spoke of jarls who sought to control all the fjords under one banner." Ragnar sat back in the judgment seat, his mind racing. Political ambition disguised as clan warfare. His family murdered not for honor or revenge, but as pieces moved in someone else's game of power. The rage that had sustained him for 3 years began to shift, finding new targets beyond the men chained before him. "These men before us," he said to the crowd, "they participated in theft. They trespassed on our lands. By law they owe compensation or face punishment. Blood for blood." Someone shouted from the back. "Perhaps," Ragnar replied. "But if their words are true, then the real enemy still walks free, planning his next move while we settle scores with his pawns." The crowd grew restless, uncertain. They had come expecting simple justice, 3 lives for the dishonor of 3 years' delay. Instead, they faced the possibility that the true enemy had never been within their reach at all. The path to the burial ground wound up the hillside behind Jarnfell, past stands of birch that whispered secrets to the wind, and over stones worn smooth by countless footsteps of the grieving. Ragnar walked it alone in the grey light before dawn, carrying Eric's practice sword in his massive hands like a holy relic. The wooden blade was perfectly balanced for a child's grip, carved from seasoned ash and weighted with lead in the pommel to teach proper technique. Ragnar had shaped it himself during the long winter nights when Eric was still too young to hold it, dreaming of the day his son would be ready to learn the warrior's path. "Hold it like this," he had shown the boy on a morning that seemed lifetimes ago. "The sword is not just wood and metal. It's an extension of your arm, your will, your honor. Treat it with respect and it will serve you well." Eric had been so eager, so determined to make his father proud. His small hands had gripped the practice sword with fierce concentration, his dark eyes serious as he mimicked Ragnar's movements. They had worked together in the yard behind the longhouse, father teaching son the ancient dance of blade work that had kept their family alive for generations. "When will I be ready for real steel?" Eric had asked after mastering a particularly difficult sequence. "When you understand that a true warrior's greatest victory is the battle he doesn't have to fight," Ragnar had replied. "When you can protect without destroying, lead without conquering, judge without hatred." The boy had frowned at that, too young to grasp the subtlety. "But what if someone hurts our family? What if they try to take what's ours?" "Then you fight with everything you have," Ragnar had said, pulling his son close. "But you remember that every life you take changes you, and some changes can never be undone." Now, standing before the stone markers that bore his family's names, Ragnar wondered if he had taught his son the wrong lessons. Eric had tried to fight that night, had died with the practice sword in his hands, following his father's teachings, even as they failed to save him. "I should have taught you to run," Ragnar whispered to the weathered stone. "I should have taught you that sometimes survival matters more than honor." The burial ground held 3 generations of his family. His grandparents, his parents, and now the 3 graves that had torn his world apart. Astrid lay between their children, as she had slept in life, her stone carved with runes that spoke of love and devotion. Eric's marker bore the symbol of a sword, honoring his brave final moments. Ingrid's showed a flower crown, remembering the joy she had brought to every day. Ragnar knelt and placed Eric's practice sword against the boy's grave marker. The wood was still solid, still balanced, still ready to teach lessons to a student who would never return to claim it. "Bjorn thinks I've grown soft," he said to the stones, as if his family could hear him across the veil of death. "The village thinks I'm afraid to act. Maybe they're right. Maybe watching you die broke something in me that can't be fixed." The wind picked up, rattling the birch leaves like whispered answers he couldn't quite understand. In the growing light, he could see the village below, smoke rising from morning fires as families began another day. Children would be waking up, reaching for parents who were still alive to hold them. The thought filled him with a mixture of gratitude and bitter envy. "The prisoner spoke truth, I think," he continued. "Someone used our family as pawns in a game we never knew we were playing. You died because greedy men wanted power, and we were convenient sacrifices. That knowledge should have brought relief. His family hadn't died because of a simple clan dispute, hadn't been targeted out of personal hatred, but somehow it made their deaths feel even more meaningless. They had been killed not by enemies but by strangers, not for honor but for politics, not in fair combat but in calculated murder. What would you have me do?" he asked the graves. "The village wants blood from these 3 warriors, but they're just tools like Eric's practice sword. Punishing them won't bring you back, won't catch the real killers, won't prevent this from happening to another family." As if summoned by his thoughts, footsteps approached on the path below. Bjorn climbed toward the burial ground, his weathered face creased with concern. He moved carefully among the grave markers, respecting the sacred space even as he sought his friend. "The village council is asking for your decision," Bjorn said quietly. "They want to know when the executions will take place." "And what if I told them there would be no executions?" Bjorn's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that killing 3 young warriors won't heal the wound in my heart or make the village safer. If anything, it will give the real enemy exactly what he wants: more bloodshed between the clans, more chaos he can exploit. Those men participated in cattle theft. They broke our laws. Yes, they did. And for that, they owe compensation or exile. But they didn't kill my family, Bjorn. They weren't even there that night. They're Svartfjord. They serve the same Jarl, follow the same leaders. They follow orders, just like we did when we were their age. Ragnar stood, brushing dirt from his knees. How many raids did you and I participate in before we became leaders? How many cattle did we steal? How many settlements did we strike in the name of glory and plunder? That was different. We were young warriors doing what young warriors do, following men we thought knew better than we did. Ragnar picked up a stone from Eric's grave and held it in his palm, feeling its weight. If someone had executed us for our youthful foolishness, who would protect Jarnfell today? Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, processing words that challenged everything he thought he knew about justice and leadership. The village won't understand, he said finally. They've been waiting 3 years for this moment. Then I'll have to help them understand. Leadership isn't about giving people what they want. It's about giving them what they need, even when they can't see it themselves. And what if you're wrong? What if showing mercy makes us look weak, invites more attacks? Ragnar looked out over the village where children played safely in their mother's sight, where fathers worked, knowing their families were protected, where life continued its ancient rhythms because people like him made hard choices in difficult times. Then I'll face the consequences of my choice, just as I faced the consequences of leaving my family unguarded 3 years ago. He turned away from the graves, carrying Eric's practice sword with him. But I won't add more innocent blood to the soil just to satisfy the village's hunger for vengeance. As they walked back down the hillside together, Ragnar could feel the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. The village expected their protector to be strong, decisive, unwavering in the face of threats. But perhaps true strength lay in restraint, true leadership in wisdom rather than force. His son had died trying to be the warrior his father had taught him to be. Now Ragnar had to decide what kind of man his own actions would teach the next generation to become. The peace treaty scroll lay buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten documents in Olaf's collection, its once proud seal cracked and its edges yellowed with age. Ragnar unrolled it carefully, reading words that had once promised lasting friendship between Jarnfell and Svartfjord, signed by jarls who were now dead, and witnessed by men whose bones had long since turned to dust. 23 years since this was written, Olaf observed, peering over Ragnar's shoulder. Your father and Jarl Magnus thought they had ended the feuding forever. What happened to it? Ragnar traced the torn edge where someone had deliberately ripped through the parchment. Who broke faith first? Does it matter? Treaties are like morning mist, beautiful to look at, but they disappear the moment someone breathes too hard on them. But Ragnar was studying the document more closely, noting the careful language that had spelled out boundaries, trading rights, and mutual defense agreements. His father had been proud of this treaty, had spoken of it as his greatest achievement, proof that warriors could build peace as well as wage war. Magnus Ironbeard died 6 years ago, Ragnar said. His son Hakon took power just before the raids on our village intensified. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone saw opportunity in a young jarl eager to prove himself. Ragnar rolled up the scroll and set it aside. Tell me about this Jarl Hakon. What manner of man is he? Olaf considered carefully before answering. Clever but not wise. Ambitious but not patient. He inherited his father's position, but not his father's reputation, and that eats at him like a worm in an apple. The kind of man who might listen to strangers offering easy paths to glory. The kind of man who might be convinced that breaking old treaties would make him look strong to his people. They were interrupted by voices outside, heated arguments that carried through the longhouse walls. Ragnar recognized Bjorn's voice among them, and several other village leaders who had grown increasingly impatient with the delay in executing the prisoners. They're losing faith in you, Olaf warned quietly. Some are saying you've grown too old for leadership, too broken by grief to make hard decisions. And what do you think? The old law speaker studied Ragnar's face with eyes that had watched 3 generations of leaders rise and fall. I think you're asking questions that a younger man would never think to ask. Whether that makes you wise or weak remains to be seen. The voices outside grew louder, and Ragnar could make out specific complaints. The prisoners had been held for 3 days, without judgment. The village looked weak, indecisive. The clans might see Hjarnfell as easy prey, if their legendary protector couldn't even execute a few cattle thieves. I should go to them, Ragnar said. But Olaf held up a weathered hand. First, tell me what you're really thinking. This isn't about 3 young raiders anymore, is it? Ragnar was quiet for a long moment, listening to the anger building outside his doors. These were good people, loyal people, who had followed his leadership for years without question. They deserved honesty, even if they wouldn't like what they heard. I'm thinking that my grief has made me selfish, he said finally. For 3 years, I've been focused on my own pain, my own loss, my own need for vengeance. But leadership means seeing beyond yourself, thinking about consequences that stretch beyond your own lifetime. And what consequences do you see? If I execute these prisoners, their clan will demand blood in return. Young Ulf has a father, brothers, cousins who will feel honor-bound to avenge him. The cycle continues. More families lose their children, and whoever orchestrated this entire conflict sits back and watches us destroy each other. Olaf nodded slowly. But if you spare them, some in the village will call me weak. Some might challenge my leadership. But the real enemy loses his weapon. He loses the clan warfare that gives him power. You're gambling with your reputation, your position, perhaps your life. I gambled with my family's lives 3 years ago and lost everything. At least this time, I'm only risking myself. The arguments outside reached a crescendo, and Ragnar heard his name shouted with increasing frustration. Time was running out for quiet deliberation. Soon, he would have to face the village and explain a decision that went against everything they expected from their protector. There's something else, he told Olaf. Yesterday, I sent a message to Jarl Hakon, requesting a private meeting. The law speaker's eyebrows rose. You did what? If these prisoners spoke truth, then Hakon may be as much a victim of manipulation as we are. His people have suffered losses too. Young warriors killed in raids that brought them no real gain. Resources wasted on conflicts that serve no purpose. Or he could be the enemy himself. And you'll be walking into a trap. Yes, Ragnar agreed. That's possible too. Before Olaf could respond, the longhouse doors burst open and Bjorn strode in, his face flushed with anger and exertion. Behind him came a dozen village leaders, their expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility. Enough delays, Bjorn announced. The village has waited long enough for justice. These prisoners must be dealt with today, or some of us will begin to question whether you're still fit to lead. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Ragnar could see the pain in his old friend's eyes. Bjorn didn't want to make this confrontation, but loyalty to the village demanded it. The others nodded agreement, their faces set with the determination of men who had convinced themselves they were doing what needed to be done. And what would you have me do? Ragnar asked quietly. What any leader would do. Execute the prisoners publicly, send their heads back to Svartfjord as a message, and prepare for the war that should have started 3 years ago. War, Ragnar repeated. You speak of war as if it were a simple thing, a problem solved by sharp steel and strong arms. Sometimes it is. And who fights these wars, Bjorn? Who dies in them? Ragnar gestured toward the doors, toward the village beyond. Our sons, our young men, who should be building families and raising children, not dying on foreign beaches for the pride of old warriors. Better to die fighting than live as cowards. The words hit like a physical blow, and several men in the crowd murmured agreement. Ragnar felt the weight of their disappointment, their growing conviction that their protector had been broken by grief beyond repair. Tomorrow, he said finally. I'll render judgment tomorrow at dawn, before the whole village. And after that judgment, you can decide whether I'm still the leader you want. The men filed out slowly, their expressions reflecting doubt and frustration. Bjorn lingered at the doorway, his loyalty warring with his duty to the village. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. "So do I," Ragnar replied. "So do I." The hidden letter had been sewn into the lining of young Ulf's cloak with such care that it might have remained undiscovered forever, were it not for the boy's nervous habit of picking at loose threads when frightened. Ragnar noticed the strange bulge during his final interrogation of the prisoners, his warrior's eye trained to spot anything out of place. "What's this?" he demanded, feeling along the seam until his fingers found the carefully concealed pocket. Ulf's face went white as parchment. "Nothing, Lord. Just patches where the cloth wore thin." But Ragnar's knife was already slicing through the threads, revealing a small scroll wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from moisture. The parchment was of good quality, the kind used by jarls and wealthy merchants, and it bore fresh ink that had not yet faded with age. "Can you read, boy?" Ragnar asked as he carefully unrolled the document. "A little, Lord. My mother taught me some letters before she died. Then you know what this says." Ulf's silence was answer enough. Thorvald and Gunnar strained against their chains, trying to see the letter that had their young companions so terrified. Whatever it contained, none of them had expected it to be discovered. Ragnar read slowly, his expression growing darker with each line. The letter was written in an educated hand, the kind of script that spoke of noble birth and careful schooling. But the words themselves were anything but noble. "To the warriors of Svartfjord," he read aloud, "the time has come to claim what was promised. Strike hard at Jarnfell's cattle, take what you can, but leave survivors to carry word of your strength. Let them think you weak and desperate, driven by hunger rather than strategy. The giant will demand justice, and when he does, you will have the chance to speak the words we have prepared." Thorvald's face had gone ashen. "Lord Ragnar, we never—" Silence. Ragnar continued reading. "Tell him of the stranger who ordered the death of his family. Tell him of the Raven Mark, of the conspiracy to control the fjords. Lead him to believe he faces enemies beyond the reach of simple vengeance. Plant seeds of doubt about immediate justice. Make him question whether blood debt is the proper path." The words hit the longhouse like hammer blows on an anvil. Bjorn stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "This is some trick. The goal," Ragnar read on, "is to turn the giant's strength against itself. Make him appear weak to his own people. Divide his village, fracture his authority. When Jarnfell tears itself apart from within, the path to conquest becomes simple." Olaf's aged face showed the terrible understanding that comes to scholars who see patterns others miss. "It's all been orchestrated. Every move, every decision, someone has been playing us like pieces on a gaming board. But who?" Bjorn demanded. "Who has the power to manipulate entire clans like this?" Ragnar turned the letter over, searching for a signature or seal. What he found instead was a small drawing at the bottom, not a raven, as the prisoners had claimed, but something far more significant. A wolf's head enclosed in a circle, the mark of the High King's personal agents. "Magnus Bloodwolf," he whispered, recognizing the symbol that had haunted his nightmares since childhood. The name sent a chill through everyone present. Magnus Bloodwolf had been a legend even in Ragnar's father's time. A jarl who had conquered 3 neighboring regions through a combination of military might and political cunning. He had disappeared years ago after the old High King's death, but rumors persisted that he was gathering power in the remote northern territories, building an army of displaced warriors and ambitious young jarls. "But he's supposed to be dead," Bjorn protested. "The stories say he fell in the Battle of Ironfjord 5 years past." "Stories say many things," Olaf observed grimly. "Dead men make convenient myths, and myths can move more freely than living enemies." Ragnar studied the letter again, noting details that spoke to its authenticity. The parchment bore the watermark of a monastery known to serve only the highest nobility. The ink was mixed with gold dust, a luxury available only to the wealthiest jarls. Most telling of all, the handwriting matched samples he had seen years ago in his father's correspondence with the royal court. "This is real," he said finally. "Magnus Bloodwolf is alive, and he's been orchestrating conflicts throughout the fjords. The raid that killed my family, the cattle thefts, even this current situation. It's all part of his plan to weaken the clans before he moves against us openly. Young Ulf found his voice at last, desperation making him brave. We didn't know, Lord Ragnar. I swear by my mother's grave, we thought we were just raiding for cattle. The letter came to us only after we were captured, delivered by a man we'd never seen before. Delivered how? Ragnar demanded. He came in the night, claimed to be a trader seeking shelter. Our guards let him into the camp and he spoke privately with Thorvald. Said he had a message from friends who wanted to help us escape. Thorvald nodded miserably. He told me the letter contained proof that our raid was justified, that Hjarnfell had been stealing from Svartfjord for years. I never opened it, couldn't read well enough to understand it anyway. He said to keep it safe and show it to you if we were questioned about larger matters. You've been carrying evidence of your own manipulation, Ragnar told them. This letter proves you're pawns, not enemies. But it also proves that someone wants me to know the truth. Why? Bjorn asked. Why reveal the conspiracy at all? Ragnar examined the letter once more, thinking like the strategist his father had trained him to be, rather than the grieving father he had become. Because the next phase of his plan requires me to know. He wants me to understand that I'm fighting shadows, that the real enemy is beyond my reach. He wants me to feel helpless, frustrated, divided from my own people. Or, Olaf suggested quietly, he wants you to abandon the path of simple justice and seek him out directly. Perhaps the great Ragnar Stonehand pursuing a phantom enemy serves his purposes better than the great Ragnar Stonehand executing cattle thieves. The implications settled over them like a heavy cloak. If Magnus Bloodwolf was truly behind the conflicts plaguing the fjords, then every response, vengeance or mercy, war or peace, might be playing into his hands. The man had built a reputation for turning his enemies' strengths against them, making them doubt their own judgment until they destroyed themselves. There's more, Ulf said reluctantly. The stranger, he said to tell you that your children fought bravely. Said to tell you that Eric held his practice sword until the end, that Ingrid tried to hide behind her mother's skirts. He said, the boy's voice broke. He said you'd understand that their deaths brought something valuable, even if you couldn't see it yet. Rage flooded through Ragnar like molten iron, but underneath it was something colder, more dangerous. Magnus Bloodwolf hadn't just orchestrated his family's murder. He had studied it, catalogued the details, turned their final moments into weapons for psychological warfare. He wants me to come for him, Ragnar said quietly. He's been preparing for years, knowing that eventually I'd learn the truth and seek revenge. My family's deaths were bait in a trap that's been waiting 3 years to spring. Then don't take the bait, Bjorn urged. Stay here, protect what we have, let him scheme in whatever hole he's hiding in, and let him manipulate other clans the way he manipulated us. Let other families die the way mine did? Ragnar shook his head. No, he made this personal when he murdered Eric and Ingrid and Astrid. But he made it bigger than personal when he turned their deaths into a weapon against innocent people. He looked at the 3 prisoners, seeing them clearly for the first time since their capture. They weren't the enemy, they were victims, just as his family had been victims. Just as his entire village had been played for fools in someone else's grand design. Tomorrow I'll render judgment, he told them. But not the judgment any of us expected when this began. The letter crinkled in his massive hands as he rolled it carefully and tucked it into his belt. Evidence of conspiracy, proof of manipulation, and most importantly, a trail that led directly to the man who had destroyed everything Ragnar held dear. Magnus Bloodwolf wanted the great Ragnar Stonehand to come hunting him. Very well. But the man who eventually found him wouldn't be the broken, grief-stricken father Bloodwolf expected. He would be something far more dangerous, a leader who had learned that true strength sometimes meant choosing the harder path, even when every instinct screamed for simple vengeance. The war hammer hung from its place of honor above the great hearth, its iron head blackened with age and use, its oak handle worn smooth by generations of hands that had wielded it in defense of Hjarnfell. Ragnar's great-grandfather had carried it into battle against sea raiders from the Western Islands. His grandfather had used it to break a siege that lasted 3 brutal winters. His father had lifted it high in victory after uniting 2 warring clans under a single banner of peace. Now, it waited for Ragnar to decide what kind of legacy he would add to its long history. The weapon was heavier than it looked, balanced for a man of exceptional strength and designed to crush shields, armor, and bones with equal efficiency. As a boy, Ragnar had barely been able to lift it with both hands. As a young man, he had practiced with it until his shoulders burned and his palms bled. As a warrior in his prime, he had made it sing through the air like a thing alive, an extension of his will and fury. But he had never carried it into battle. His father's generation had been the last to see true war in these fjords, and by the time Ragnar inherited leadership, diplomacy, and deterrence had replaced the bloody solutions of earlier times. The hammer had become a symbol rather than a tool, a reminder of strength held in reserve rather than strength deployed in anger. "You're thinking of taking it down," Bjorn observed from the doorway. His friend's voice carried a mixture of hope and concern, as if he couldn't decide whether Ragnar arming himself was a good sign or a dangerous one. "I'm thinking of many things," Ragnar replied without turning away from the weapon. "I'm thinking that my great-grandfather would have settled this matter in a single afternoon. Challenge the enemy to single combat, let the gods decide who was right. Simpler times, were they? Or were we simply too young to see the complexity beneath the surface?" Ragnar reached up and touched the hammer's handle, feeling the grooves worn by his ancestors' grips. "This weapon has been raised in defense of our people for over a century. It's never been used for vengeance, never been lifted in anger, never been turned against the innocent." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that tomorrow's judgment will determine what this hammer means for the next century. Whether it represents wisdom or wrath, justice or revenge, protection or destruction." Bjorn stepped fully into the longhouse, his weathered face showing the strain of the past few days. "The village is restless, Ragnar. They've heard rumors about the letter, whispers about conspiracies and hidden enemies. Some are saying you're using it as an excuse to avoid making hard decisions. And what do you think?" "I think you've been carrying the weight of this choice alone for too long. I think it's time to trust your friends with the full truth of what you're planning." Ragnar finally turned away from the hammer to face his oldest companion. Bjorn's loyalty had never wavered, even when Ragnar's grief had made him difficult to follow, even when his decisions had seemed to contradict everything they had learned about leadership and strength. "I'm planning to break the cycle," Ragnar said simply. "The cycle of blood for blood, clan against clan, generation after generation, repeating the same mistakes their fathers made. By sparing the prisoners, by showing them a different path, by proving that strength can build as well as destroy. That true leadership means making choices that serve the future rather than the past." Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, processing words that challenged everything he thought he knew about justice and honor. "The village won't understand. They've been promised blood for 3 years. Then I'll have to help them understand. I'll have to show them that vengeance is a luxury we can't afford when the real enemy is still planning our destruction." Magnus Bloodwolf. "Magnus Bloodwolf," Ragnar confirmed. "A man who has been playing us against each other while he builds power in the shadows. Every clan feud serves his purpose. Every act of revenge weakens us for his eventual attack. So what do you propose? That we ignore the crimes committed against us? That we pretend justice doesn't matter? I propose that we redefine justice, that we make it about preventing future suffering rather than punishing past mistakes. That we turn our enemies into allies before Bloodwolf can turn us all into corpses." The plan that had been forming in Ragnar's mind over the past sleepless nights was ambitious, dangerous, and completely contrary to everything his people expected from their leader. Instead of executing the prisoners, he would release them with a message for their Jarl. Instead of preparing for war with Svartfjord, he would propose an alliance. Instead of seeking vengeance for his family's deaths, He would focus on preventing other families from suffering the same loss. You're gambling everything on the hope that Jarl Hakon will listen to reason, Bjorn pointed out. What if he sees your mercy as weakness? What if he takes your offer of alliance as an invitation to attack? Then I'll have learned something valuable about his character, and we'll face the consequences of that knowledge together. Ragnar walked to the great table, where maps of the surrounding territories lay spread like promises of future battles. But if he's truly being manipulated by Bloodwolf, if his clan has been suffering losses just as we have, then he might be ready to hear a different strategy, and if the village refuses to follow you down this path. That was the question that had kept Ragnar awake through the long nights, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced like ghosts of all the decisions he had ever made. His authority as leader came from the consent of the governed, from the trust that he would protect their interests and uphold their values. If he violated that trust, if he chose a path they couldn't follow, then his leadership would end as surely as if he had fallen in battle. Then they'll choose a new leader, he said quietly. And perhaps that would be for the best. Perhaps they need someone who can give them the certainty I can no longer provide. You're willing to give up everything you've built here. I gave up everything that truly mattered 3 years ago. Everything else is just responsibility, duty, the weight of decisions that outlive the men who make them. Ragnar traced the boundaries of Hjarnfell's territory on the map, thinking of all the families who depended on his judgment. All the children who played safely because of choices he had made in council meetings and dispute resolutions. There's something else, Bjorn said reluctantly. Messengers arrived this afternoon from 3 neighboring clans. Word has spread about our prisoners, about the delay in executing them. The other leaders are concerned about what they see as weakness in our response. Concerned enough to do what? Concerned enough to consider whether Hjarnfell can still be counted on as an ally. Concerned enough to wonder if our territory might be better managed by leaders with stronger stomachs for justice. The implications hit Ragnar like cold water. His decision to spare the prisoners wasn't just affecting his own village. It was sending ripples throughout the region, encouraging ambitious jarls who might see opportunity in what they perceived as Hjarnfell's weakening resolve. Let me guess, he said grimly. The messages came from Jarl Eriksson of Ironhold, Jarl Thorson of Ravenfjord, and Jarl Grim of Blackwater. How did you... Because those 3 have been looking for an excuse to divide Hjarnfell's territory between them for years. My father kept them in check through strength and careful diplomacy, but they've been testing our boundaries ever since his death. Ragnar rolled up the maps with sharp, decisive movements. Magnus Bloodwolf isn't just manipulating individual clans. He's been preparing the entire region for conquest. Every act of apparent weakness, every moment of hesitation, every choice that goes against traditional expectations feeds into his larger strategy. Then you know what you have to do. Yes, Ragnar said. But his tone held no certainty, only grim determination. I have to make a choice that will either save our people or destroy everything my family has built for 5 generations. I have to bet our entire future on the hope that wisdom can triumph over tradition, that mercy can prove stronger than vengeance. He looked once more at the warhammer hanging above the hearth, thinking of all the battles it had won, all the enemies it had defeated, all the problems it had solved through the simple application of overwhelming force. Tomorrow he would face his greatest challenge without it, armed only with words and hope and the desperate belief that there had to be a better way forward than the bloody path his ancestors had walked. Will you stand with me? He asked Bjorn. Even if the village turns against us, even if the other clans see it as weakness, even if we're wrong about everything and this choice leads to disaster. Bjorn looked at his friend, the man who had saved his life in a dozen battles, who had stood by him through every triumph and tragedy, who had carried the burden of leadership with more honor than any warrior deserved, and nodded slowly. I'll stand with you, he said. Not because I understand your choice, not because I think it's wise, but because I trust the man making it. If Ragnar Stonehand believes this is the path forward, then it's the path I'll follow, no matter where it leads. The warhammer would remain on its hooks above the hearth. Tomorrow's battle would be fought with different weapons entirely. And the victory, if victory came at all, would be measured not in enemies defeated, but in futures preserved. Not in blood spilled, but in blood saved. But first, Ragnar had to survive the judgment of his own people, and convince them that sometimes the hardest choice was also the right one. The ceremonial drinking horn gleamed in the morning light that streamed through the longhouse windows, its carved surface telling the story of Jarnfell's founding in intricate spirals and ancient runes, filled to the brim with honey mead blessed by the village priest. It would seal whatever judgment Ragnar pronounced, making his decision binding before gods and men alike. The entire village had gathered before dawn, packing the great hall until bodies pressed against walls and children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see over the crowd. Their faces reflected 3 years of pent-up anger, frustrated justice, and expectations that had fermented into something approaching desperation. They had come to witness vengeance finally delivered, to see their protector reclaim his reputation through the ancient ritual of blood for blood. Ragnar took his place in the judgment seat, feeling the weight of carved oak beneath him and the heavier weight of 5 generations of precedent pressing down on his shoulders. To his left sat Olaf, the law speaker whose memory held every legal tradition their people had ever established. To his right stood Bjorn, whose loyalty had never wavered, even when loyalty meant following a friend into potential disaster. The prisoners were brought forward in chains that rang like funeral bells with each step. Thorvald the Red walked with the resigned dignity of a warrior who had accepted his fate. Gunnar Bloodaxe kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet the gaze of people whose cattle he had tried to steal. Young Ulf looked around the packed longhouse with the wide eyes of someone seeing his own death reflected in hundreds of hostile faces. By the laws of our fathers and the customs of our people, Olaf intoned, his voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence. We gather to render judgment upon these men of the Svartfjord clan. They stand accused of raiding, theft and trespass upon the sacred lands of Jarnfell. The charges are proven, Bjorn announced. They were caught with our cattle, weapons in hand, with no right to be upon our territory. A murmur of satisfaction rippled through the crowd. This was familiar ground, comfortable territory where guilt was clear and punishment followed ancient patterns. Ragnar could feel their anticipation building like pressure behind a dam, waiting for him to speak the words that would release 3 years of accumulated rage. Instead, he reached for the hidden letter tucked within his belt. Before judgment is passed, he said, his voice cutting through the expectant silence. There are truths that must be spoken. Truths that change the nature of the crimes we gather to punish. He held up the parchment so all could see it, noting how some faces showed confusion, while others displayed the first hints of unease. This letter was found sewn into young Ulf's cloak, placed there by agents unknown after their capture. It reveals a conspiracy that reaches far beyond cattle theft, far beyond clan rivalry, far beyond anything we imagined. Ragnar read the letter aloud, watching as understanding dawned on face after face. The revelation that their prisoners were pawns rather than enemies. That the entire conflict had been orchestrated by Magnus Bloodwolf. That even this moment of judgment might be playing into larger plans. It hit the assembled crowd like waves against a crumbling cliff. Lies, someone shouted from the back of the hall. Svartfjord tricks to save their worthless lives. Convenient discoveries, called another voice. Papers that appear exactly when our leader grows too weak to do what must be done. But Olaf was examining the letter with the trained eye of someone who had spent a lifetime authenticating documents and verifying claims. The parchment is genuine, he announced. The ink is fresh, but the watermark is royal, available only to the highest nobility. The seal mark matches records from the old High King's court. It proves nothing. The voice belonged to Hakon the Smith, a man whose own son had died in a Svartfjord raid 5 years prior. Words on paper don't change the fact that these men came to steal from us, that their clan murdered innocent families. That justice has been delayed long enough. Shouts of agreement filled the longhouse. 3 years of waiting had built a momentum that simple evidence couldn't easily redirect. The crowd wanted blood, needed vengeance, demanded the satisfaction of seeing their enemies pay the ultimate price for crimes both recent and ancient. Ragnar stood slowly, his massive frame commanding attention even from those who disagreed with his methods. "You speak of justice," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "But whose justice? Justice for the dead. Who cannot be brought back by more killing? Justice for the living, who deserve protection from future threats? Or justice for ourselves, who need the comfort of simple answers to complex problems? Justice for Jarnfell," Hakon shot back. "Justice for the families these bastards have destroyed. Justice that shows our enemies we're not weak, not broken, not afraid to defend what's ours." The crowd roared approval, but Ragnar raised his hand for silence. "I understand your anger," he said. "I've carried that same rage for 3 years, nurtured it, fed it with memories of my children's faces and my wife's final breath. But rage is a fire that consumes everything it touches, including the one who carries it." He lifted the ceremonial horn, feeling its weight and significance. Whatever words he spoke next would be sealed by tradition, bound by sacred ritual, impossible to take back once the mead was drunk. "These 3 men are guilty of cattle theft," he said clearly. "By our laws, they owe compensation or exile. But they are not guilty of the greater crimes we have attributed to them. They are not the masterminds of conspiracy, not the architects of our suffering, not the true enemies who have manipulated us all." The simple iron ring that Ragnar pulled from his finger had been forged by his own hands 20 years ago, hammered from metal taken from a sword he had broken in his last great battle. It bore no jewels, carried no elaborate decorations, held no monetary value beyond the cost of raw iron. But it had been his wedding band, the symbol of vows spoken to Astrid beneath the summer sky. And now it would become something entirely different. "I make my judgment," Ragnar declared, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs that filled the longhouse. "These 3 men will live." The explosion of outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Voices rose in fury, fists shook in the air, and several men moved toward their weapons before Bjorn's stern gaze reminded them where they stood. The sound was like nothing Ragnar had ever heard in his own hall. The sound of trust shattering, of loyalty turning to betrayal, of a people watching their protector fail them in their moment of greatest need. "You're not fit to lead," Hakon the smith shouted above the chaos. 3 years we've waited for justice, and you give us cowardice." "My son died for nothing," screamed another voice. "Murdered by these dogs, and you set them free like honored guests." But Ragnar stood unmoved in the center of the storm, waiting for the fury to exhaust itself against his silence. When the voices finally began to quiet, when exhaustion started to replace rage, he spoke again. "I set them free because holding them serves our true enemy's purpose," he said. "Magnus Bloodwolf wants us divided, wants us weak, wants us so consumed with fighting each other that we cannot stand against him when he finally moves openly." "More excuses," someone called out. "No," Ragnar replied firmly. "Strategy. The same strategy that kept this village safe when I was young, that built the prosperity you've all enjoyed, that made us strong enough to be worth attacking in the first place." He held up the iron ring so all could see it. "This ring bound me to Astrid in marriage. Today, I forge it into something new, a bond between former enemies, a promise that the cycle of revenge ends here, a symbol of the alliance that will make us stronger than we've ever been." Working quickly with tools brought from the smith's forge, Ragnar began to reshape the ring. His hands moved with the skill of long practice, hammering the metal into a larger circle, adding links, creating something that could bind 2 hands instead of adorn 1 finger. "You're mad with grief," Hakon declared, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "This plan will get us all killed." "This plan," Ragnar said without stopping his work, "is the only thing that might save us. Look beyond your anger for a moment and see what's really happening. 3 neighboring clans are already questioning our strength. Magnus Bloodwolf has agents throughout the region, sowing discord and preparing for conquest. If we execute these prisoners, Svartfjord will demand blood in return, giving Bloodwolf the war he needs to justify intervention." The crowd was listening now, their fury cooling into something like uncertain attention. Ragnar could feel the shift, the moment when immediate emotion began to give way to longer-term thinking. But if we return them alive, with a message of alliance rather than threats of war, we deny our enemy the very conflict he spent years orchestrating. Ragnar finished the ring and held it high, its new form catching the morning light. We turn his weapon against him. Young Ulf found his voice at last, speaking from his place among the chained prisoners. "My father has 3 other sons," he said quietly. "If I die here, they'll come for revenge. If I live and carry your message of peace, they might listen to wisdom instead of grief." "The boy speaks truth," Thorvald added. "Our Jarl has been pushed toward war by counselors who appeared after the old alliances were broken. Men who promised easy victories and rich plunder, but he's not evil, just misguided." Ragnar approached the prisoners, the alliance ring warm from the forge fire. "I offer you a choice," he told them. "Return to your Jarl with word that Jarnfell seeks alliance against our common enemy. Carry proof that Magnus Bloodwolf has been manipulating us all. Help us build something stronger than either clan could achieve alone. And if we refuse," Gunnar asked, "then you'll be banished to the wildlands, left to make your own way without clan or kinship. Alive, but dead to everything that makes life worth living." The 3 men exchanged glances, weighing options that ranged from difficult to impossible. Finally, Thorvald nodded. "We accept your offer, Lord Ragnar. We'll carry your message and speak your truth." Ragnar clasped the alliance ring around both his wrist and Thorvald's, binding them together in a gesture that would have been unthinkable hours before. "Then let this ring remind us both that strength shared is strength multiplied." The longhouse had grown quiet, the crowd processing a resolution they had never expected to witness. Some faces showed approval, others confusion, and many still reflected the anger of expectations denied. But the decision was made, sealed by ritual and witnessed by the entire village. Bjorn stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "The prisoners will need escort to the boundary," he said formally. "I volunteer to lead that party." "And I," said Eric the fisherman, surprising everyone. "My nets have been cut by Svartfjord raiders. But if there's a chance to end this cycle, I'll take it." One by one, other villagers stepped forward to offer their support. Not all of them, not even a majority, but enough to show that Ragnar's vision had found fertile ground in at least some hearts. The alliance ring gleamed between former enemies as they prepared to leave Jarnfell not as executed criminals, but as unlikely ambassadors carrying hope instead of hatred into an uncertain future. The memorial stone stood where the old boundary markers had once divided Jarnfell from Svartfjord territory, but now it marked something entirely different. Carved from granite that would endure for centuries, its surface bore the names of all who had died in the conflicts between the clans, not just Ragnar's family, but young warriors from both sides who had fallen to the manipulations of Magnus Bloodwolf, Erik Ragnarsson, age 10, Ingrid Ragnarsdottir, age 7, Astrid Eriksdottir, beloved wife and mother. Below their names were others. Olav the Bold, killed in a raid 2 summers past. Bjorn Ironside, barely 16 when he died fighting cattle thieves. Magnus Greybeard, an elder murdered for the silver in his home. The stone held them all, victim and aggressor united in death as they had never been in life. "It's finished," said Ulf, now grown into a man of 21 summers, his face bearing the wisdom that comes from surviving choices that could have led to death. He stepped back from the memorial, his hands still dusty from the final carving work. Every name, every date, exactly as you requested, Ragnar nodded, running his scarred fingers over his children's names. The letters were deep enough to last for generations, cut with the same care that Astrid had once put into her weaving. They'll be remembered, he said quietly, not as victims or enemies, but as the price we paid for learning that there had to be a better way. 1 year had passed since the morning when he had spared 3 prisoners and changed the course of history in the northern fjords. The alliance with Svartfjord had held, despite skeptics on both sides who predicted immediate betrayal. Jarl Hakon had proven to be a man of honor once freed from the whispered counsel of Bloodwolf's agents, and together the 2 clans had rooted out the network of spies and manipulators that had kept them at each other's throats. Magnus Bloodwolf himself had been found 3 months ago, cornered in a mountain stronghold by warriors from 6 allied clans who had finally understood the scope of his manipulations. The man who had orchestrated so much death had died fighting rather than face judgment, taking with him the satisfaction of seeing justice fully served. But his network of agents had been shattered, his plans for regional conquest left in ruins. The children play together now, Bjorn observed, pointing toward the village green, where youngsters from both clans chased each other in games that knew no boundaries of old rivalries. My grandson counts Svartfjord boys among his closest friends. As it should be, Ragnar replied. The future belongs to them, not to the grudges we inherited from our fathers. The prosperity that had followed the alliance exceeded even Ragnar's optimistic projections. Trade flowed freely between the settlements. Fishing grounds were shared rather than fought over, and the combined strength of both clans had deterred would-be raiders from testing their defenses. Children who might have grown up nursing hatred for ancestral enemies instead learned cooperation, shared resources, and mutual respect. There's news from the capital, Ulf reported, producing a scroll bearing the High King's seal. Official recognition of the alliance, along with an invitation for you to serve as regional administrator for the crown. Ragnar accepted the scroll, but didn't open it immediately. Political advancement had never interested him, and power for its own sake seemed like a hollow prize compared to the simple satisfaction of watching children play safely in village streets. What will you tell them? Bjorn asked. That I'm honored by their confidence, but I have everything I need right here. Ragnar looked out over the valley that had become home to 2 peoples instead of 1, where former enemies had become neighbors and friends. Let younger men chase titles and territories. I'm content to tend what we've built together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, families from both clans gathered around the memorial stone for the evening remembrance. It had become a tradition, this daily moment of reflection, where the living honored the dead while celebrating the peace their sacrifice had made possible. Children who had never known clan warfare laid flowers at the base of the stone, their innocence a testament to how completely the world had changed. Parents who had once sharpened weapons against their neighbors now shared meals and stories, their children learning to see strangers as potential friends rather than enemies. Ragnar stood with them, no longer the broken giant consumed by grief and rage, but an elder whose wisdom had been earned through the hardest lessons life could teach. The man who had once been defined by his ability to destroy had found greater strength in learning how to build, how to heal, how to turn enemies into allies through the simple courage of choosing hope over hatred. Astrid would be proud, Bjorn said quietly, noting how his friend's face had found peace at last. She would remind me that the real work is just beginning, Ragnar replied. Building peace is harder than making war, maintaining alliance more difficult than winning battles. But it's work worth doing, work that honors the memory of everyone whose name is carved on this stone. As darkness settled over the valley, torches were lit around the memorial, their warm light reflecting off the granite surface where names of the dead promised that their stories would never be forgotten. The children gradually dispersed to their homes, carried by parents who no longer feared what tomorrow might bring. secure in the knowledge that wisdom had triumphed over vengeance, that love had proven stronger than hate. Ragnar remained at the memorial until the last torch burned low, one hand resting on the stone where his family's names would endure long after his own time had passed. They had not died in vain. Their loss had become the foundation for something better. Their memory, the inspiration for choices that saved countless other families from the same grief. The giant of Jarnfell had learned that true strength sometimes meant staying his hand rather than raising it, that the greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through compassion. In choosing mercy over vengeance, he had found a legacy worthy of the love that had been taken from him, a future where children could grow up safe, where former enemies could become brothers, where peace could flourish in ground once watered with blood. The memorial stone stood sentinel in the darkness, guardian of memory and promise of hope, ensuring that the price of wisdom would never be forgotten by those who inherited its rewards.